They're in cannabis, they're in crypto, they're gamers, they are content creators. They can go to college for these things, right? Their parents are probably freaking out right now because they don't know what their kid is doing.
And those are things that they couldn't have even tried because 10 years ago, they didn't exist.
Welcome back to the OpenEd podcast. I'm your sometimes host, Ella, and today I'm joined by your other sometimes host, Isaac. Today we have something really special. Today is going to be a panel on the future of work, right? So everybody talks about what is the purpose of education, where are kids going, what's going to light them up. So to get us started, I am going to introduce Michael Horn and Michelle Rhee. I'm so excited to have them on the podcast as additional guests today. So can you give me a little bit of information, background on where you come from, how you got started in the space, just so that parents who are not familiar yet with your work kind of understand where you came from?
Michelle, why don't you go first? Yeah.
All right. Michelle Rhee. I spent the vast majority of my career in K-12 education, leading nonprofits, a school district, the Washington, D.C. Public School District, and then some advocacy organizations after that. And what I would say is that when I was in the field of K-12 education, and in particular when I was in DC in 2007, we would hear all of the time the fact that employers, the vast majority of employers in America, were saying that they could not find the skilled workers that they needed for their mission critical jobs. And so I always used that as sort of a rallying cry for what we needed to do in public education. And I found myself like decades later thinking nothing has really changed. Like the employees are still saying the exact same thing. I left public education, and then a colleague of mine called me and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about starting this new company." And it was a software company called Build Within that was focused on apprenticeships. And I was like, well, I don't know anything about workforce development, but like very quickly I sort of figured out, oh, this is a way that I could potentially meet the same goal that I was trying to sort of bring to fruition in education, and just sort of doing it more directly. And so that is where and how my passion in workforce development really evolved.
Very fascinating. Michael, would love to hear your story.
Yeah, sure. So I guess like Michelle, I started in education in the K-12 space. I started working with Clay Christensen, the legendary professor of innovation at the Harvard Business School. We wrote a book called Disrupting Class, How Disruptive Innovation Will Change the Way the World Learns. And midway through that, I co-founded the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation, which I ran for about a decade. And we were initially focused on K-12 education. And then in 2010, 11, somewhere around then, a lot of people in higher ed were reading our work and were like, you're describing our universe and there's actually disruptive innovation going on here as opposed to your wishes in K-12 perhaps. And very quickly, the unlock that I had was, gosh, like it's actually really hard to create change in K-12 because it's somewhat of a dependent system on higher ed. That is, we think of good high schools as that which gets its students into quote unquote good colleges. But if colleges are misfiring, then the whole system behind it misfires as well. And so I was like, gosh, we got to start working on higher ed and disrupting that system. And then you go up one more rung and you realize actually how we think about skills and talent and developing individuals is pretty flawed at that level as well. And it's sort of this series of dependencies. And that brought me up through Guild education, which I worked at for a couple of years. And then this book, Job Moves, that came out in November. We started just focusing a lot more on how does the workforce itself work and how do we help individuals navigate it and develop their passions and potential. And so now really K through career, I spend time on all those problems and how do we rethink it and make it both less linear in all three, but so that people can find their way through at the same time, which I think is the big challenge that we have at the moment.
I love that.
It's so funny hearing both of you because I have kind of had the reverse version in terms of where in the life cycle. So I was working in a nonprofit. I was actually doing fundraising when I kept meeting with all these business owners who said the exact same thing, Michelle, you said. I can't find any workers. And this was like 2008, 2007 era. There's all these kids coming out with degrees, master's degrees. They don't know how to do anything. I don't want to hire any of them. Who am I going to find to help grow my company? And I was raising money for programs that were like career coaching and placement programs to help people. And many of the young people were like, oh, nobody wants to hire me. I guess I'll go back and get a master's because it's the only way I can defer making payments on my student loan. Like literally that was the decision. Take on more debt so I can wait. And maybe that will make me hireable. So I started at the higher ed side, at the career side, saying, well, what is it that these employers are actually looking for? If it's not a degree, what is it? And why do these kids not have it? And who does have it? And how can you help them get it? So I started an apprenticeship program that was, an alternative to college. Hey, come spend 6 months. We'll give you a boot camp and then we'll place you and someone will pay you for 6 months to work. And with the knowledge that you don't quite know everything yet, but you're inexpensive, you're kind of, we used to say like entry-level talent, intern level prices, right? So for the employer, it's like, hey, don't worry, we're giving them additional support and helping them. And it was really successful on a small scale. We had a couple hundred people would go through every year. It's still going today. Great program. But I got this itch to see if I could do this at a larger scale. So I started a tech platform called Crash. Long story short, it crashed. Don't name your company Crash, I guess. But I really wanted to take one slice, like, how can we help people create a signal of their value that is more effective than the degree? The degree is a very devalued signal. It really doesn't say that much about you. And a typical resume doesn't either. So how can they prove value, demonstrate it? And so it was like video pitches and things that we had found worked for Praxis grads all the time. Kids who were 19 and had no experience and no degree were getting jobs that said degree and 3 years of experience required. By doing this, but it was really, really hard to get more than a couple hundred people a month to do this. And I had the reverse of y'all who were working earlier in the stage. I thought, by the time kids are 18, 19, 20, and they start looking at careers, their habits and mindsets, it was really hard to what I call de-school them. So there's only a small percentage and you really have to work hands-on and like coach them. And it wasn't very scalable. So I thought, well, we got to start earlier. We have to try to help people get out of that conveyor belt mindset earlier so that by the time they get here, it's not so hard to get them out of the, all I got to do is buy a degree and someone will hand me a job mindset. So I ended up now in the K through 12 side, trying to help people think differently there, but very similar ways that our paths have crossed.
I absolutely love that. And I think, it's fascinating that you all have had this experience going through K-12, having seen all of these different, these kids and then these adults go through this path. Michael, you said that that you're trying to make it less linear, right? And Michelle, I'm curious, so how has this conversation changed over time? Like, as you've been in this industry, how has the conversation that you've been having with parents and also students changed over time? Because I know that, like, when y'all started, it was all wishes, right? These are the things that we wish would happen. Now there's a lot that is actually happening. So what have you exactly seen?
Well, I would echo what both Michael and Isaac said, which is that when I was initially involved in K-12 public education, the pathway to a successful career was through college. And so as education reformers, I think we were over-indexed for sure on, this sort of college for all mindset. And I think it was only when we began to see that lots of kids that were going through successful charter management organizations and that sort of thing who, we'd really sort of closed the gap with those kids in terms of their academic achievement levels. But then they were going on to higher ed and getting into a lot of debt, not necessarily, graduating or graduating and not really sort of having job prospects that but I think we had guaranteed, right, were going to happen. And I think the landscape has changed significantly now because I think young people just think way differently about work. I tell this story about how a few years ago, my husband and I moved into this fancy apartment building in downtown Los Angeles, like super pricey place. And we realized very quickly that we were the oldest people in this apartment building, like times 2 easily. And I kept saying to my husband, like, what do all these kids do for a living? Like, we can barely afford to live in this place. Like, what, what do they do for a living? So my husband was like, I'm gonna find out. And for 2 weeks, every time he was in the lobby or got in an elevator with one of these kids, he was asking them, like, what do you do? And he came back and reported to me, reported out after that time period. He was like, all right, they're in cannabis, they're in crypto, they're gamers, they are content creators, all these things that we were like, they can go to college for these things, right? Their parents are probably freaking out right now because they don't know what their kid is doing.
And those are things that they couldn't have even tried because 10 years ago they didn't exist.
It didn't exist. And so I think that is a big part of the landscape change, is that now there are jobs that there are not college and very like specific pathway programs to prepare folks for those careers, and kids are seeing those. Young people are seeing those and thinking, okay, well, how do I access those? And so I think one of the biggest challenges that we face right now is that there are so many different kinds of opportunities out there that were not even, dreamed of a few years ago. And I don't think young people are clear on, okay, what are they? How can I prepare myself for them? And I think we as adults in the system are equally sort of befuddled as to like, okay, how are we going to manage kids with these various jobs that are out there? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that exists right now.
I agree with that. And I want to bring it back to this in a moment. But first, I want to kick it over to Michael, actually. So as Michelle was talking, it was clear that what kids want has changed, or maybe not even. What does the ambitions that kids have say about what the job that they are searching to get done? What is the thing that they are actually looking for in pursuing all these like various, non-traditional paths?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think where I'm hesitating is I think it also depends on context, right? In a lot of cases, and it's there are some trends for sure, right? But it's hard to overgeneralize, I think, one way or the other. Something that Michelle told me on when she was on our podcast was, like 10 years ago, everyone was about purpose in work. And now it's a little bit more utilitarian. People say like, hey, I'm going to have a couple gigs and like, it allows me to do my purpose, which might not be connected to work. And I think both of those answers are totally okay. And different individuals have different answers around it. But the point, I think, is that sort of the mindset 40, 50 years ago around which our structures are built around was, you're going to go 4 years of college and like have your 40-year career. And that is definitely not what's happening in either of those two visions, right? Like that's the big thing that's changing is people change jobs every 4 years on average. 1 billion people switch jobs worldwide every single year. And it's not linear, right? They're not like, okay, I'm coming in as the entry-level employee. I'm an individual contributor. Now I want to be a manager, then a director. Then no, it's not looking like it swirls, it loops. People have a couple side hustles. Sometimes it's super purposeful what they're doing, and sometimes it's not, right? And it's very stage context dependent. And I think that's part of this also is like motivation. It like context and motivation have both shifted quite a bit in this moment. And I think that's one of the reasons we also struggle. And maybe I'm jumping ahead, but just like to Michelle's point around how it was such a college for all movement, and now it's careers we don't even understand. I think the answer of schools to think like you can shut the outside world and keep it outside the school walls, and somehow teachers and school counselors are going to be able to provide the answers to students in a world that like they've never been in, that they don't understand, is incredibly naive. And we have to think of like a much more set of porous boundaries between these worlds to help people frankly meet different individuals and figure out what those pathways are, or get those opportunities, or figure out like which part of the tribe am I going to be in, right? Am I working to find purpose elsewhere, or do I find purpose in work? I don't think there's a right answer on that, but I think we have to be able to create opportunities for individuals to navigate regardless of where they land on those different spectrums.
One thing as you guys are both talking it's really easy when we talk about like, hey, how to prepare people for career, getting caught up in what should we teach? What specific skills or methods of teaching those skills? And sometimes there's like a much simpler starting point, which is just exposure. Can we just increase the exposure to different things that humans can do and make a living doing? And even as a homeschool dad who works from home, I have to remind myself, my kids have no idea like what my job is and what I do all day. And I try to remind myself, like, have them come in and like sit in here while I'm working and ask me questions about what's this spreadsheet or what's this. Because often, like the critiques you hear when people say, oh, look, over here in China, kids all want to be scientists. And the number one job kids want in America is YouTuber. It's because that's what they've seen. Like when I was a kid, you were told that the jobs available to you were like firefighter, astronaut, and like guy who carried a briefcase. No one knew what that other one was, right? So of course I wanted to be like a baseball player or a fighter pilot because everything else was just in this big bucket, like business. I don't know what that means. I remember my brother took a career assessment when he was like 16 and it said, you should be a jeweler. And it's like the most random, he's one of the most successful entrepreneurs, by the way. He went into accounting, whatever else. But like this idea that you just kind of take a couple of things and put labels on them, it's really being around and being exposed to. So that's what I love about the work from home and remote work and even kids doing virtual and blended school, just increasing the exposure to different types of careers and knowing that they're possible. And this is what's cool about all the YouTube and all that stuff. Yes, kids can get addicted to it, but them seeing, I'm not good at engineering, but my kid gets to watch Mark Rober. And now he has an idea of a possible future that I couldn't provide him just on my own. So I think just exposure alone opens the imagination for kids.
So I would go, I agree with that, but I would go a step further to say, like, in addition to exposure, it's actually just doing, right? And this is one of the things that when Jimena and I were running Built Within, I was most shocked about amongst employers, which was that what we realized is like, all right, this notion that you're going to go to school for 4 years, go to college for 4 years and learn, and then you're going to go do, right, was just so outdated, so antiquated for the way that young people think. And that's why we built Built Within, right, is because like, okay, you have to be able to train people in a much more sort of elastic, flexible way. Because to Mike's point, they're going to go into a new job and a new career in a few years' time. And so the notion around it was, not just the exposure piece, but also like we have to have young people like in these jobs actually doing. And as educators, we know that this is the best way that people learn, right? It's not just reading books, but actually doing things. But the pushback that we got from employers was pretty significant, right? Like at first they'd say, oh, I don't think we can hire these folks. They don't know this. And it took a while, but you could tell like once something clicked in their heads where we were saying to them, any entry-level employee who has never done this job before, they are learning on the job and you have to do things and make mistakes and see other people do it well, et cetera, to really become good at something. And then once they sort of realize like, oh, like, yeah, I mean, all of our entry level, like payroll specialists, right? We have to like train them for a certain amount of time. And we're like, right, that's essentially an apprenticeship, right? And so it took a while because the notion of an apprentice immediately in their mind, like, didn't resonate. But once we sort of said, it's really just about like learning and doing simultaneously to become effective at your job. With some employers, they were finally able to say, well, this is what happens with all entry-level people. Right.
Interesting. Michelle, I'm curious, what was the further pushback? So like what else were they afraid of? The people that told you no at the end?
I would say the other thing was I would chalk it up to like a short-sightedness, which is people would say to us, we don't lack talent. We lack skilled talent. We need somebody who can be productive for us today. Like we can send out for a call, right? Or to build a website, and we don't have to teach them anything. Like they can do that from day one. And so then their strategy for how to build the workforce was just poaching from other companies, right? because I know this person knows how to do that. And it just, to us, seems so short-sighted. Like, well, especially in like the trades and construction and some businesses or sectors where like you have an aging workforce, and continuing to just poach from other people is not like figuring out how you're going to build the workforce of the future. It was hard to get people past that and thinking more long-term about like, you have to start earlier in the pipeline, and you really have to build up skills within people earlier. And it, in the pressure of like, we have to produce these deliverables, we got to get this job done, it was hard to get people to think in that way.
Yeah, Ella, just on that, I think something that I think shares across the ecosystem is like reducing risk for each of the parties in all these transactions, right? So if you think about like college or any higher education path, like any post-high school pathway that students take, taking on a lot of debt when your success rate is 6 out of 10. If you're low income, by the way, it's closer to 1 out of 10. And then graduating. And then if you do graduate, if you are quote unquote successful and you graduate, 50% of those people get a job that doesn't require the degree. And then 90% of those people are stuck in a job 5 years later that still doesn't require a degree. Like, that's a lot of risk to be taking on as an individual, right? So the notion of an apprenticeship where you can get paid while you're learning all of a sudden takes off that risk. And so then I asked the same question that Michelle did. Okay, well, so companies clearly the zero-sum game of just poaching is not going to solve their pipeline challenges. But for most companies, it seems that they need to find ways to de-risk this as well, because they know talent only stays in the job for 4 years. There's a lot of movement. They don't want to be training the person that someone else is going to free ride off of. And so how do you create either through government or frankly, like innovative financing mechanisms and things of that nature, or different contracts, like ways to de-risk it for the employer as well, and make it easier for them to come to a yes and be a little less short-term focused on that question. And then I think the third piece of it, frankly, is like managing people, particularly as we start to think about middle and high school age, right, who are really going to be inexperienced, and sort of this youth apprenticeship model that people really want to see take off, but is struggling to in a lot of places. How do you give meaty work for those individuals, but also supervision that doesn't take away from the day-to-day of the business? These are harder problems, I think, to work out in the day-to-day than sort of someone like me in my office writing articles wishes it were a lot of times. But this is sort of where I think you have to figure out, how do you take off risk or work that feels like, yeah, I know it's the right thing in the long run. It's like taking vitamins and exercising, but maybe in the short term day-to-day, it'd be better if I just, cranked on email for an extra hour instead of went to the gym.
An area that gives me a lot of hope and that I'm kind of like following with great interest is the realm of sports. You see something really happening, and I think the college rule changes accelerate this, where you kind of have this, it's not like fully vertically integrated. It's not like the Los Angeles Lakers have a peewee 5-year-old basketball team that they own, but you do have an actual system, because now you're able to, colleges are all competing for these kids. So then they have these high schools that are just designed to get you ready for a certain sport. And brands are also competing to sign people. So I live down here in Florida. You have IMG Academy. I was getting my hair cut, and the woman there said, yeah, my grandson, he just got all of his tuition paid to go to IMG Academy by Under Armour. And Under Armour will sponsor a bunch of people because they're like, hey, a few of these might end up in the NFL. And if we caught them when they were 17 or 16, great. And you have, like, my son, he's 8. He's on a travel baseball team. They don't travel very far, but it's they keep making younger and younger teams. It's part of this club. The coach of the local high school, which is a very competitive baseball team, he realized he wants a feeder. He wants all the best talent to come to his high school. So he created a middle school club team, and then he created a younger one and a younger one. Now they start at age 8, and he has this whole mechanism to filter up so that by the time they're in high school, he's already been working with them for years. He's been training them. He's helping them. And it's like you're taking some elements of that apprenticeship, because they're not just learning about baseball. They're playing baseball, but they're playing it with other 8-year-olds. They're not playing it in the big leagues at age 8, right? I think there's kind of this interesting, it takes some elements from the old, like, trade guilds, but it adds the freedom to come and go as you please. My son might play for 1 year and then decide he wants to quit, right? It's not the rigidity of like cartels and guilds that are very, very structured and rigid without the freedom of mobility, but it does have that. There are levels and there's like this whole feeder system. And I think it'd be really cool to see that happening more in more other careers.
That porousness that you just referenced at the end, I think is really important though, as we do this, right? To keep people generalists before they over specialize too early, right? I mean, David Epstein's written really well about this in Range, about, over specialization in youth sports, I think is the dramatic craziness of that as well. On the other side, right? Where we specialize way too early as opposed to generalize, and figure out like, where do I grok, right? Where does this really resonate? And then frankly, just meeting people. So I think there's the 3 legs: exposure, actually doing the work, and meeting real people who do the work and building up networks in different places. Because at the end of the day, that's also how we get jobs, is through who you know. It's not through applying with a resume online. And I think that's going to become even more so as, AI is now writing the applications and resumes, matching it to the job description. AI on the other side is filtering. And so AI is having a conversation with AI. If I'm the hiring manager, I don't believe at all that resume coming through represents the real person. And so I call up Michelle and I'm like, hey, do you have a good person for X post? She's like, oh yeah, totally. That's how I de-risk it. Again, coming back to that notion of risk. And so I think social capital network becomes even more important. And we have to be really intentional about making sure kids get connected as a result.
I love this. And I kind of want to switch the focus of this conversation. So you all were talking about all of these approaches to apprenticeships and creating a nonlinear path for your kids and focusing on being a generalist before you specialize too much. Most of our audience is homeschool parents, right? And so they are doing this on their own. They're looking at this, they're saying, okay, yes, I want my kid to get an apprenticeship. Or maybe even it's the kid themselves that's saying, okay, yes, you know what, this is going to be really valuable for me. Isaac, I know you have a lot of thoughts on this, but I would love to kick it over to y'all. Where would you even begin as a parent, as a kid, trying to say, okay, I know I need experience. I know I need to create some sort of foundation for where I'm going next. I need to just take a step, even though it's kind of hard sometimes and it's kind of scary. Where would you suggest people go first?
I'll be really brief here and kick it over to the others. I would just don't look at the whole humongous problem that you just outlined. Like, how do I get to some world where I'm entrepreneurially, apprenticing? Just start with like lowest hanging, simplest step, the lowest hanging fruit. Like, is there something that I don't hate that seems somewhat interesting that someone would let me do or shadow them while they do? And just try it. And if you go shadow someone for a couple days or a couple weeks and you're like, oh, this stinks, I don't want this anymore. Okay, fine. You can check that off your list. But just start there with something really simple. If your kid's interested in something, can you find, like, my girls like to bake. Can you find a bakery and say, would they be able to come in and just like shadow? What if they wash dishes? They may say no, but just try to find some step like that that lets them get a little higher degree of exposure than they currently have and participation if possible.
I love that. I was going to say something very similar, and something my wife is always telling me when we're solving this for our twin girls is like, let's solve the current problem as opposed to the problem 5 years from now, right? And I think that's the same mindset, right? Is like lots of sprints, lots of exposure, lots of opportunities to build. And if you're homeschooling, right, quote unquote, the academics are, taking a couple hours a day, you have a lot of time and flexibility to plug into different organizations in a variety of different ways and use that flexibility and freedom and connections and frankly other parents in the network to, hey, can my kid come over there to your office? I'd love to take, your kids right over here. Power of network can go in a lot of different ways and just, follow what the kid thinks is their interest. And then keep pushing them out of it slightly just so that they learn more right over time. And I think Isaac said one thing that's really important also, which is this is less about finding the thing and more about learning and also crossing things off the list.
I would just add to that that you can't underestimate the power and value of just general, sort of general skills, what people would say soft skills, durable skills, those sorts of things. But I remember, when my girls were little, they had to sit through too many car rides where I was on speakerphone, having a performance evaluation, hiring somebody, firing somebody, negotiating a contract, whatever. And they would be in back listening to all of that stuff, right? And sort of that. And when they were young, I also paid both of them before they graduated from high school, work in a service job, right? I was like, you go scoop ice cream, flip hamburgers. You have to have that experience of dealing with an unhappy customer, you name it. And I think that when I look at my girls now, I would say that them just sort of learning a lot of those general skills serve them well now and have served them well in like lots of different roles that they've had, because they have some of these just really strong foundational skills. And Isaac, to your point, I think my kids were lucky because they had exposure to that. I mean, it wasn't necessarily voluntary that they sat through all of those calls. But they had the exposure. They heard the language. They saw like how you navigate through some of these difficult and challenging situations. And when you don't have that experience, you don't have that exposure, you don't then those can be sort of the things that really serve as obstacles for young people in terms of seeing success in the workplace.
Yeah, I like that. At what point? So, like, I mean, this might differ between children. It might differ between, how ready they are. But like, at what point do you actually start wanting them or letting them get hands-on? So you were talking about exposure is the most important part. And something fascinating. So one of our partners in Kansas, super cool. They do a lot of different things with us for open education. They're called the Learning Lab. And inside the Learning Lab, there is a micro school where the founder and leader has been working to get each of his kids apprenticeships that fit them. So he has a really cool network within the Wichita area. He talks to individual small businesses and he says, okay, I will go drop them off. They'll be with you for 2 hours. We're just going to get them exposure. Y'all were all mentioning that at a certain point, right? Like the skills that they're going to be needing are going to be more complex, right? So how do you over time start to convince people to like let your kid, let's say you have a 16-year-old who's ready to go, to have more responsibility?
I mean, honestly, I think it's about what people in sports refer to in sales, et cetera. It's about getting the reps in, right? If you watch something enough times or hear something enough times, you sort of gain confidence. And then I think young people are gonna be like, okay, I've seen it. I have some pattern recognition now. Like I can do this, right? And so I think a lot of it is about just, not just like, okay, I'm going to show you how to do this once. Like, are you ready to do it or not? It's about sort of like that consistency of getting the reps in. I think that can build confidence both from an employer side, but also from the worker side.
This kind of happens naturally unless you crush it. And as parents, like we crush it a lot, not intentionally necessarily, but kids, if you watch kids, they watch stuff. They watch their mom cutting vegetables or their dad, whatever, grilling, mowing the lawn. They watch, and then all of a sudden they want to do it too. And it's not always practical. You can't always, but the more you're willing to let them, and even though they're going to do it way worse and they're going to slow you down and it's going to be crazy, maybe slightly dangerous sometimes. The more you can allow them to, the more that they now have that naturally baked in and that comes naturally to them later on in life. I know like with my oldest child, I was not good at this. I was too quick to be like, no, you can't do this. I'm trying to get something done. And it took him, I've actually like learned later, he has way more of a, I can't do things unless I'm an expert sort of thing going on than my other kids do, because each kid, you get a little more patient, you go right. And like, I realized, oh, okay, it's on me, the parent, to take the added burden of the messes and the frustration and the slowdowns. Again, you can't always, there's not everything you can have your kid involved in, but like, it was too easy for me to just be impatient and say, no, you just watch. Let me handle it. Let me do it. I think that's really important, because if you don't crush it, it doesn't really get wired in them. They don't think that, like my youngest, he thinks he can do everything, sometimes hilariously so. And he has to, learn the hard way that he really isn't as good as grown adults at many things. But like that kind of attitude of, yeah, I can participate. I see something new. Why don't I try it? I think is kind of more natural to humans if we don't beat it out of them.
I wonder though how we create those kinds of environments with employers, because like we were talking about before, the stakes are higher there, right? And the employers, they got to deliver things. They have to complete jobs. They have, to please the client. And so I think that in those environments, it's hard for them to give that kind of freedom and, leeway and experimentation, because they feel like they can't afford to.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
suddenly envisioned, sorry, Michael, he's like, you know how you have like the parent driving the car and then you got like the little baby steering wheel next to them that the kid is driving. I imagine like walking up to a store and having the normal cash register and the attendant there, and then having a little one off to the side that says like apprentice register, like you can go here if you want to, but be warned,
But you're speaking to where I think I was going to go, which is like, I think something that's going to change and is changing, right, is using AI to create simulations so that people can get reps in low stakes settings, and frankly, lots of them, even if your parents don't know, right, the opportunities, is something that I think is going to get much, much more possible. I will say, like, I've been a bit of the VR AR skeptic over the years. And I think with AI being able to very rapidly create very real situations in those environments now, that is changing. Like, we're at a tipping point, and you see like the Meta glasses or Ray-Ban glasses and stuff like that. Like, this is not hard to imagine very low stakes simulation environments where you can get reps in, and then you can start to take those next steps into actually, you're less of a risk, right? To Michelle's point. Because I do think at the end of the day, it does also have to be a real performance at some point. The second thought on that also is, I think entrepreneurship is an opportunity for young people to get some of those reps in as well, and then bring professionals in to perhaps like give feedback, right, on whatever they created, in a very real way. And look, maybe it doesn't start into a business, but the kid just getting a rep, right, in a very real way, trying to build a business, trying to, code an AI agent that does something, and then getting real feedback. Like, these are things that we can actually start to do, that maybe are a little less path dependent on the employer sitting alongside and having to get an outcome on the other side. Are a couple ideas there.
I'm totally with you on that sort of AR VR. I'm all like this. I feel like this is the way that we're going to train folks. And one of the things that I have been thinking about, because I've talked to a lot of companies through Equal Opportunity Ventures, where I am now. So I talk to founders every day who have different kinds of solutions. And I think along these lines of, how do you get the reps in? What I think is most interesting or has the most potential is when you don't have people sitting in a cave somewhere saying, okay, like, what's an example of a scenario that somebody might go through as a teacher or a police officer or a salesperson, right? But now we have the ability to actually gather real data, right? And so, I was talking to somebody the other day about like simulations for teachers, right? Because classroom management and sort of, those tough interactions with kids is what kills most first-year teachers' spirits, right? Is because they can't get their way through those. So could somebody sit there and be like, oh, what are those tough interactions versus like, we now have the ability to gather this information, like real, how often are these kinds of situations happening? And when effective teachers are sort of diffusing that situation versus like more ineffective teachers and how are they handling it, right? And which ones like produce the outcomes that we want. Like we have so much more ability with technology now to figure out like how do we aggregate those real life situations and put them to use in trainings. And I would say from our standpoint, like we're trying to figure out like who are the founders who are doing that in what verticals and how can we like quickly sort of capitalize those things and bring them to market so that we can have just much more effective training programs in place.
Super interesting that you said that, because I hadn't thought about this before, but like you imagine some of the apps that took off right during the teacher eval, like the last decade or so, they have hours and hours and hours of authentic video and audio capturing of those moments, right? It's like some of them are trained on teacher talk time versus student talk, et cetera, et cetera. And it's designed to give feedback to the teachers actually in the classroom, but could they turn around and build those simulations off that? That's really interesting.
Do you think that that would change the way that people hire too? So like instead of going through a regular job application as they do now, it's like everybody goes through the simulation and you hire the best of the best.
So yes, but with a caveat. And the caveat is there are some regulations in the U.S. That are very that want to make sure there's no bias, right, in terms of certain hiring decisions. I think you could very easily argue that the college degree is actually one of the most biased signals that we have in the economy, but it's been traditionally interpreted around assessment, and that you have to show that it's valid and reliable without disparate impact, which is a pretty high bar to clear on the disparate impact one, because there's a lot of factors that go into that, right? And so I think we need a little bit more evolution of like, yeah, we don't want to be biased, and we have to think through how can we give like meaningful task-based, if you will, assessments that like you would actually do in this job, and lower the barriers to employers feeling like that's a valid way to make choices. There's a lot of experimentation, but there's a lot of nervousness, I think, on the part of hiring managers that I talk to about going all in because of some of those regs.
And Michael, to your prior point about the way that people get jobs is through networks and connections, we also see that is oftentimes how people get promotions and new opportunities is through those networks and those relationships. We have another portfolio company at our firm called Sigma Squared, and what they're really focused on is working with employers to base decisions off of data on the effectiveness of their workers versus those sort of more relational things, and really kind of taking the bias out of those decisions. And also another thing that they've done, which I think Ella goes to a little bit what you were talking about, is by gathering the data from the employers, they're able to create what they call like the success DNA, right? What do we know? What do we know about our workers who are most effective, and how can we map that back to what we knew about them before we hired them? And so, can we hire people who are more likely to stay and who are going to be more likely to be successful, but do that based on the data? And I think the more we can move to those kinds of systems, and I think you're going to see more sort of equity and better, diversity, et cetera, across our companies, because it's going to be less sort of, based on relationships and more based on what do we actually know about folks.
Interesting. As you're talking about this, though, I'm wondering if there's any issue whenever it comes to like when you put, for example, an intern in a situation that they are not yet comfortable with. Sometimes they don't like it, like they don't enjoy it because of the fact that they are not comfortable with it, you know? So like, how do we make sure that whenever you do something like for example, an assessment in the beginning, just to put people in situations that might come up, that it's not a deterrent? Because, right, like, I would be curious to hear your take on this as well, but I've definitely seen, at least among my friends, that they're more motivated to do work that they love, more recently than not. And I'm curious if that would be a deterrent at all. So like I've undergone this assessment. I really didn't like a couple of these experiences. Everybody goes through experiences they don't like in a job, right? So how do you make sure that that's not an issue either? Sorry if
So
that was a little like
no. I think it's a great point. So two sets of data points, I guess, from you. So the research we did in Job Moves, the process that came out to help people make progress in their careers focuses a lot on the underlying activities of what you do and where do you get energy and where does it drain energy, and being super reflective about that and at different points in your life. So if you were talking about students right now, like after they do things like, did that drain or drive your energy? And then reality check, there is no perfect job where you get 100% energy drive. Like it does not exist. There are trade-offs and elements of suck in every single job. A good job, frankly, from the research is one where you are just over 50% in flow. So roughly 50%, like just, wow, it drained my energy. So the second part of that is a friend, colleague of mine, and Diane Tabner, who ran Summit Public Schools for 20 years or something like that. She has a new startup called Future.me. And she basically has young people looking through their actual experiences and figuring out, like, what do I like doing, right? To your point, where do I get energy and where do I not? And then start to understand some of, like, okay, so what are these patterns in advance? I think one of the biggest tragedies, frankly, of high school right now is that, or I should say conventional high school, I think it's less true in the homeschool community, but that people graduate with no sense of what am I good at and what do I like doing? Where do I get energy? And I think it can't be at a surface level. Like, oh, I like working with people. Okay, like what about working with people do you really like? Where are you most in flow? What does that look like? Is it you leading a team huddle? Is it you bouncing ideas off? Like really getting deep into what does that look like? And then starting to find matches off of that. So hopefully that starts to answer a little bit, is like ideally we know more about ourselves before we even get to that simulation, if that makes sense.
So I'm wondering if we could go back to something that we brought up earlier, which is this notion. Michael, you and I talked about this on your podcast. Is like I am hearing more and more that young people are saying that their job is just sort of means to make money so that they can do the things that they want to do.
Yep.
And that I think is very counter to, our generation, where we thought the ideal thing is to love your job and be passionate about your job. And I feel like nowadays young people just, that's not the priority. And I wonder, I started writing a LinkedIn post on this. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm wondering whether that may be a detriment to us in the long run, to have a generation of workers aren't really as invested and engaged and passionate about their jobs. Is it fine because, they'll be happier people and maybe happier workers, be better workers, that sort of thing? Or is it going to put us at a disadvantage and make us less innovative and less productive as a country because people don't really feel passionately about what they're doing? I really sort of wonder about this.
I'll give a off the top of the head hot take, I guess. I think the pendulum swung too far in the you have to find your greatest passion, you have to do what you're called to, and it created all this stress and all this worry and kind of made us forget that like one thing that makes people feel fulfilled is just working hard and feeling good that you put in a hard day's work. And even if what you do doesn't seem to be like this lofty vision. So I think it swung a little too far. It's swinging back, which I think is good. It definitely and probably could swing too far in the other direction. But I love though, like, because I tend to be on that lofty, find work that you love, find your passion. That's just the way I'm wired. But I always like to try to bring back and like remind myself not to be like judgy or overly highfalutin. And I always think of this story, Barry Sanders, who I think is the greatest running back ever. He was known for just like crazy juke moves and insane spins and stuff. And somebody asked him once, like, how do you come up with all these moves? Like, where's all this come from? He said, I don't know what you're talking about. Getting tackled hurts really bad. I'm just trying not to get hurt. And it was like, there was nothing amazing about it. He wasn't like, oh, the art and the grace, and I practice dance and I do. He's literally just like, I'm just trying to avoid pain. And the result of him avoiding pain was this masterful,
That's
graceful
hilarious.
thing that we all got to watch. So sometimes like just trying to make a living can actually result in something beautiful and artful as well.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this in terms of the purpose piece, which is like, and Michelle, like, again, our conversation really sparked me thinking about this, right? And looking back at our data set. And it seemed like some people get purpose through work. Some people work to get purpose outside of work. And some people, frankly, work to like try to figure out what is the purpose, right? Like it's part of a question that they're asking. And so I think like those are three very different sort of answers to the purpose question, which I'm in the man's search for meaning Viktor Frankl camp of the world, but I think we shouldn't over-index on where it is. And to Michelle's wondering, like, I do think there has to be engagement though. And like what we see right now in the world of work is roughly 70% of individuals say they're completely checked out of their job. 50% are actively looking for something new right now. And there's a whole phrase to describe that now, quietly quitting, right? That's not sustainable either. And so I think we have to find that balance, right? And it will look different for different individuals. And it will look different for different individuals, also different stages of your life, right? Like, I constantly say this to my wife because she's like she was in food and beverage and so forth, and she's trying to figure out like with our kids in early teens, like what am I doing? What's my purpose? Blah blah blah. I'm like, Clay Christensen, my mentor, went back to business school at age 40 with 5 kids to get a doctorate, and like no one heard of him until like 7 years after that, right? Life is much longer also than I think we need. And we're like in such a rush to climb the ladder sometimes that we don't take the longer view.
And does that go back to your point about us needing to redefine the linear aspect of career?
100%. And school, frankly, right? Like I was really good at playing the game in school of like, just tell me the hoop and I'm going to jump through it for the minimal work possible. And then at some point when you get out in the real world, you realize like, oh, life isn't lived on this like just ladder that I'm constantly comparing myself to other people. In fact, that's a way to be destined for unhappiness, I think. And so, yes, I think it's less linear at all stages would be a healthier thing for all of us.
So you were saying that this is my last question before I hit y'all with a couple of rapid fire questions, but you were saying that young people today jump between jobs quite frequently, and also young people today are not the most satisfied by their jobs or fulfilled. Maybe they're doing it for other purposes. I'm curious how that all relates. Like, why are they jumping, right? If they are not seeking their job to be their fulfillment.
I guess my quick answer, and then I'm sure Isaac and Michelle have a take, but from our data, like people, it's not necessarily a drive for purpose, but it is a drive for progress in their lives. And so if you were just getting beaten up, destroyed, like dead end, manager micromanaging you, whatever like set of pushes, right? Can't pay the bills, what struggling for time with my kids, whatever it might be. Those are like really big pushes that cause someone to say, wow, I need to start looking for something different, right? And so in our data set of thousands of individuals who switch, there's 14 different pushes that sort of occur. And when 3 to 5 of them are present, that's when people are really actively looking for the next thing, and they switch to make progress, but they're not seeking perfection. None of us are. And I will tell you, a lot of the people who switch, because they didn't understand what progress looked like for them, they wind up right back in the same situation that they were, not making the progress that they desired, if that makes sense. So, and we can see this data again really clearly in the Great Resignation. 100 million people left their jobs in 2 years in the United States. 75% of them within 6 months regretted the move. And I think it's just because like we actually haven't really thought about what's progress, and we're almost so hyped up on we just got to get the job that like we'll say anything about our past experience and what we like just to get it. And then we find ourselves in it, and we're like, oh man, this isn't helping me.
I have a hypothesis or a guess. I have no validation for this. I don't have all the great research back of me like Michael does, but an observation and I guess a question. I remember when we were running Praxis, there was a certain type of person who was amazing at the job hunt, the part of trying to win an apprenticeship. And they would end up with a whole bunch of offers and they didn't want to take any of them.
Huh.
And I used to say, like, don't let options blind you to opportunity. This idea that once I say yes to one, then I can't do any of the other ones. Now I'm locked in. And they liked having all these theoretically I could do 10 things, but the minute I choose one, I can't do those other 9 anymore. And I wonder if just we're having to try to relearn the ability to stick with something and say sometimes doing one thing concretely, even if it's not the perfect thing, is better, and sticking with it until we get through the dip and come into the good part. Because we are in a world where, like, I can customize this. None of us watch the same TV shows at night. None of us listen to the same music during the day. We all used to just have to take what was given. There was 3 options, and we're so used to, I don't like this song, immediately skip it 10 seconds in. That's not a bad thing, but it makes it harder for us in other areas. I've seen this with my son. He's had some jobs where he's been like, that's it, I'm going to put in my 2 weeks, and I'll just ask him a few questions. And eventually he'll be like, well, maybe I'll wait a little longer. And then a month later, he'll be like, I'm so glad I stuck with it. I'm finally getting it. I love this job now. Sometimes 2 months later, he hates it again. But the reward for sticking through, and again, I feel crazy saying this because I'm the guy that wrote articles all the time about how you should leave the bad situation and get out of the job that's sucking your soul and drop out of college if you hate it. But I do think there is a little bit of stick-to-itiveness that gets lost in a culture full of options.
I'm in violent agreement with what you just said there. I will say I think we also need to teach people how to make trade-offs, and to get their highest priorities, if that makes sense, and not see it as settling. But like, again, there's going to be an element of suck in anything you do. It's just life. But you choose the thing that's going to suck so that you get the thing that you're most prioritizing at that moment in time. We never talk about that. We imagine a friction-free environment, which, Isaac, to your point, there's certain parts of our lives where we've created that, but it's not life in general.
And everybody has nostalgia for Blockbuster too. We all kind of have fatigue on streaming too many movies to choose from, you know?
No, exactly. Okay, my final question I'm going to hit y'all all with quick. The first answer that comes to your head. Y'all are all parents. From the parent perspective, what is your best advice for a parent becoming an open education designer for their kid and helping them to go through this line of K-12 to career?
All right, I'm going to drop something that just kind of a funny little thing. What if, when your kid gets a great report card or they get a recognition or a ribbon at a sport, you hang it on the fridge, you hang it on the wall. What if them getting someone other than family to pay them their first dollar for anything was treated with that same level of pride, like a restaurant does? Hang that first dollar on the wall. You got somebody to pay you $1 for some value you created for them. I think that's a really fun question to think about, getting them thinking career and entrepreneurially early.
I'm going to say something that we were literally just talking about, which is, I think that for many women of my generation who are working moms, we had that sort of like working mom guilt. And so when we did spend time with our kids, we wanted to make everything so like frictionless, right? Like sure that I'm doing everything for them. And I think that when we do that as parents, we do a disservice to our kids. The research is very clear that kids who have to go through hard things and figure it out, and there is actually a lot of friction in their lives that they have to muster their way through, are much more successful in the long run. And so I'd say like letting go of like all that working parent guilt stuff and letting your kids do hard stuff.
I kind of want to just leave it there. That was such a good answer. Is that a cop-out on my part, or could I just say what Michelle said?
No, we'll let you say what Michelle said. That was awesome.
Mic drop on her behalf.
Yeah. The perfect note to end it on. Thank you both so much for coming on the podcast, and this was such a cool conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.